Good evening, and thank you very, very much for coming tonight. But before we begin and introduce Dr. Chomsky, I'd like to have Gary Tartikoff please stand up. Gary is retiring this summer after 22 years chairing the World Affairs with the Committee on Lectures. Dr. Noam Chomsky first spoke at Mr. Tartikoff's first year and is now speaking again at his last year. So please help me in thanking Gary. In August 2003, I emailed Dr. Chomsky inviting him to speak at Iowa State. To my surprise, he responded. Although he declined my offer, he encouraged me to keep working. Well, Dr. Chomsky, it took me 3 years, but 3 years later, here you are at Iowa State again. So thank you for coming. Dr. Chomsky has written and lectured widely on linguistics, philosophy, intellectual history, contemporary issues, and international affairs and U.S. foreign policy. He is on faculty in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Tonight he will be speaking on global justice and human rights. It is with my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Noam Chomsky to Iowa State.
Inevitable first question is whether you can hear me. So yes? No. How about that? Is that any better? No. How about that? Still no good. Okay. Any techies around who know how to fix this? Could you hear him? You could. So there's something about my voice. Let's see. Anything got to be pushed here?
Hello. Can we get the mic turned up, please?
That one's working? Well, I'll use that. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Here. Do you want to move
how's
it or should I
that?
put it in there?
Okay, yeah. If it drifts, just start letting me know. Hold it close. Okay, can you hear me in the back? Yeah, okay. Gary, I hope I'm not responsible for your forced retirement. Just one comment on the book signing later. I've signed books all over the world, and the worst experience I ever had was in Brazil. And the reason is everybody in Brazil has about 4 names, none of which I can understand. So if there are any Brazilians who want book signed, please write your name out. Every other country is okay. What I'd like to do actually is just make a couple of remarks on the issues that are of the greatest concern to Americans now and for some time, in fact. Judging by polls, actually for some time, the greatest area of concern for Americans is the Middle East. The most serious problem, according to Gallup polls, is, and in fact the highest throughout 2000 for a long time before, twice as high as the next, more than twice as high as the next problem is Iraq. The second greatest problem, less than half that ranking, is the economy. The most feared country is Iran. We could ask whether that's because Iran is really feared or because it's been the subject of an unremitting barrage of government media propaganda designed to make people terrified of Iran. Be an interesting research project. You recall, I'm sure, that we repeatedly go through this experience, most recently in the fall of 2002, when there was a huge government media barrage warning everybody that you have to be afraid of Saddam Hussein, quickly drove the United States off the international spectrum. Everybody hated Saddam, in particular the countries he'd invaded, Kuwait and Iraq, but only Americans were afraid of him, terrified of him. And it's happened repeatedly before, something that ought to concern us. The only other area of the Middle East that receives enormous coverage, usually more than any other country, often more than all other foreign countries combined, is Israel. And that provides a telling example of the topic of least concern to Americans, at least judging by the written word, and that's the fate of Palestinians. I'll come back to that. The second topic I want to discuss is, we'll keep just at domestic concerns. So what are the major domestic concerns of Americans? Well, there's an easy winner on that. Gallup polls again, it's healthcare. So say something about that. And thirdly, if there's enough time, I'll say a couple of words about what my personal view is about what ought to be the major concerns. So let's begin with what is the major concern of the Middle East. Major problem, a serious problem, is Iraq. There's plenty of commentary on Iraq. On the other hand, there's very little reporting on Iraq. And there's a reason for that. It's not that reporters are cowards or that they're not there. It's that the military catastrophe that the U.S. has created in Iraq has absolutely no precedent that I can think of. You can't, first time there's been a war where you can't report from it. Reporters are mostly stuck in the green zone, the heavily fortified zone in downtown Baghdad, or else they're embedded, surrounded by Abrams tanks and troops and so on. And there's very limited reporting that you can do in that manner, so we're really not getting reporting. The reporting you're getting is mostly from Iraqi stringers who then give information or whatever they give to reporters in the green zone who sign their reports, dateline Baghdad, but could just as easily be dateline Washington. On the other hand, there is a great deal of discussion, and it's obviously an important topic, and it is the problem that Americans feel is the greatest problem that they face. Of particular importance is the framework of the discussion. It's narrow but familiar. Actually, a couple of weeks ago, had an interview with a Polish reporter, reporter for the leading Polish newspaper, and we were talking about this, and I asked him if he had been reading Pravda during the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. I didn't have to say anything else, he just laughed. The reason is the framework was about the same. Noble cause, too many casualties, can't give the freedom and benefits to the poor people of Afghanistan that we're trying to because of the terrorists and the bandits and so on and so forth. That's all you could talk about. And in fact, that's true here. The framework of discussion here about Iraq is approximately at the level of a high school newspaper reporting on the local football team. I mean, you can ask how they're doing, can we do better, or should we get a different coach, like the generals are now saying about our coach. Why are these terrorists preventing us from doing all the wonderful things we want to do, and so on. That's the framework of discussion. It's a noble cause. The question is, could we win somehow? That's familiar too. Those of you who are interested in things a few years ago in scholarship might take a look at the leading journal of the Society of the Historians of American Foreign Relations. It's called Diplomatic History, the current issue, and their current professional journal, the last issue of it, happened to be devoted to Vietnam. And there's a debate. The debate has a range of opinions discussed in scholarship. There's the dovish extreme, which says it was a mistake, tried to do the right thing, we misunderstood, I didn't know enough about Vietnamese history, we misunderstood the doctrine of containment, and so on. It was too costly, it's a bad mistake. And then there's what's called the hogs, noble cause, agree with the doves, but we could have won. If we hadn't been stabbed in the back, we have to learn how to win next time. What about the population of the United States? Well, we happen to know a lot about popular opinion. That's interesting. By 1969, about 70% of the population said that the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. But that's not an option in scholarship, and it was not an option in journalism. And so those numbers remain pretty stable until the most recent studies, which is pretty astonishing because people are saying that on their own. They haven't read it, they haven't heard it, but somehow they still think it. If it was a topic of discussion, the numbers would be undoubtedly far higher. But anyhow, the population is just kind of off the spectrum. It's worth noticing that brings up a pretty serious domestic problem about the dominant intellectual and moral culture in the United States. That's a problem that has enormous implications for us and by virtue of U.S. power for the entire world. There's something missing from the discussion of Iraq, totally missing. That's the question of aggression. So you might do a search and see if you've ever seen that word mentioned in connection with the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Anybody ever call it aggression? And so that was never any problem when we were discussing the Russians in Afghanistan. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, everyone called it aggression. Rightly, that's what it was. Also, there was no problem giving the reasons, even reasons that went beyond the actual ones. So they were invading Afghanistan, it was alleged, because they wanted to gain access to the oil of the Middle East. Dubious, but at least that was the charge. They wanted to extend their power, something like that. Those are standard reasons that we give when somebody else does something. But for ourselves, that's off the agenda. That's taboo, strict taboo. Cannot be. Our leaders only act from noble intentions. They make mistakes. They don't understand. They don't know enough about foreign cultures. They didn't study Vietnamese at Yale or whatever it was. But they can't be doing anything wrong. Every other country does something wrong all the time. We discuss them with no problems, allies, enemies, and so on. But not us. There's a name for that in American intellectual history. It's called American exceptionalism. It's traced back to what's called Wilsonian idealism up to the present. The United States is a city on a hill. It's exceptional, different from everyone else. There's a lot of things wrong with that phrase. The most obvious thing that's wrong with it, which is rarely discussed, is that it seems to be a historical universal. I've yet to find a single great power that didn't have the same exceptionalism, including the worst monsters. So I hate to mention the precedents because we don't want to think about them, but another research project you might look at is to see if you can find any violent, aggressive power, any imperial power that did not present itself in exactly the same fashion. Uniquely noble, totally benevolent, giving everything to the benefit of others, badly understood, hated by the people we're trying to help because they don't understand us, and so on. And try to find an exception. Which I've looked pretty hard in countries that have records. My suspicion is that if we had records from Genghis Khan, we'd probably find the same thing. So American exceptionalism appears to be universal. That doesn't mean we should be willing to tolerate it, but we should recognize where we are and what we stand. Well, what about the concept of aggression? It's a well-defined concept. It's not obscure. It was defined at the Nuremberg tribunals. That's, in fact, what laid down the standard for contemporary international law on these issues. It was defined by the chief of counsel for the prosecution U.S. Justice Robert Jackson, who we really ought to study. He defined to the tribunal, he said, an aggressor is a state that carries out invasion of its armed forces with or without a declaration of war of the territory of another state. Well, that's clear, unambiguous. Explain it to my grandchildren with no problem. That was backed up by an authoritative General Assembly resolution accepted without objection. The Nuremberg Tribunal went on to define aggression as the supreme international crime, which differs from other crimes in that it encompasses within it all the evil that follows. Okay, so every horrible thing that happens after the aggression, that's part of the supreme international crime. In the case of Iraq, it means Abu Ghraib, the much worse war crimes in Fallujah, comparably worse than Abu Ghraib. It includes the toll on the population, about which we can find out a lot if we choose. So by October 2004, that's after 16 months, the most careful, best analysis of the number of dead as a result of the invasion was about 100,000. And that was on pretty conservative assumptions, if you look at the way it was carried out. By now it's, who knows, maybe double that. But by October 1964, acute malnutrition had doubled to the level, since the invasion, had doubled. It was then at the level of Burundi. That's below Haiti and Uganda. UNICEF added that translates to roughly 400,000 Iraqi children suffering from wasting, a condition characterized by chronic diarrhea and dangerous deficiencies of protein. This, incidentally, is in a country where hundreds of thousands of children had been killed by the US-UK sanctions. They're called UN sanctions, but they're in fact US-British sanctions. It's become much worse since. That was October '64, and there's plenty more. So let me just mention one example that's very rarely discussed, the educational system. It was devastated under the sanctions, and it's been dealt a terrible blow under the occupation. Here's some quotes from a Western-trained, US-trained Iraqi scientist, Imad Kaduri, a recent article which appeared in the Egyptian press, unfortunately not here. He says that the invasion led to looting and destruction of 84% of Iraqi universities, the liquidation of university professors, and the implementation of sectarian attitudes and practices among students. And that's in a country which boasted probably the first university in the world, established in 1227. It was a center of learning that was destroyed by the Mongol invasion of 1258, then reestablished, and it remained intact and well preserved until the US-led invasion, when, along with the rest of Iraq's historical and cultural sites, it suffered destruction and negligence and may not survive. Hundreds of scientists and other educators have been assassinated. Many are fleeing. There's speculation in Iraq that some of this is Israeli Mossad death squads. Doesn't matter whether that's true or false. It tells you something about the prevailing mood. And we can go on. Well, there are accepted consequences of aggression. Again, we can go back to Nuremberg. The consequences of aggression were hanging, not for people who pushed Jews into crematoria, but for the leadership, not for the soldiers, for the leaders. That's who was tried at Nuremberg. For example, the German foreign minister, von Ribbentrop, was hanged. One of the main charges against him was that he was involved in a preemptive war against Norway. Germany invaded Norway to deter the very real threat of a British attack from Norway. Sentence, hanging. There are, at the trial, Justice Jackson pronounced some eloquent words which are worth thinking about. He said at the final judgment, "If certain acts of violation of treaties are crimes, They are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. And we are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. To pass these defendants a poisoned chalice is to put it to our own lips as well. Actually, that's also in U.S. law. There's a War Crimes Act of 1996 passed by a Republican Congress, which includes severe punishment for grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, death sentence if the breaches lead to killings. Violations of the Geneva Conventions aren't even concealed. In fact, they're reported with pride, which is kind of interesting and remarkable. So take, say, the invasion of Fallujah in November 2004. The first act of the invaders was to take over the General Hospital. And on the front page of the newspaper, take a look at the front page of the New York Times that day, it's not hidden. Big picture of patients lying on the floor, hands tied behind their backs, doctors lying on the floor, all under guard in the Fallujah General Hospital. The reporter says that the General Hospital was a legitimate target because it was producing propaganda. The propaganda was casualty figures, which, according to the reporter, are inflated casualty figures. Inflated because our dear leader said so. But suppose it were. The Geneva Conventions are very explicit about this. Read them. They say, in any conflict, all combatants must protect completely any health system. Medical, doctors, nurses, hospitals must be protected by all combatants. Anything else is a grave breach of the conventions. If anyone died as a result of that treatment, patients being thrown on the floor with hands tied behind their backs and so on, if anyone died, then George Bush should get the death sentence under U.S. law. U.S. law. That's the part however, that's probably not a problem, because as you may remember, his legal counsel, Alberto Gonzalez, had foreseen this. There's a memo which ought to be famous, in which Gonzalez advised President Bush before this that he ought to effectively rescind the Geneva Conventions to reduce the threat of prosecution. A very interesting memorandum. Some of them didn't have to be rescinded. The U.S. did sign the 1949 Geneva Conventions, but there are additional protocols. There's a protocol of 1977 that introduces what's called technically the doctrine of distinction. It says armed forces must distinguish civilians from combatants. Okay, civilians have to be protected. Combatants you can attack. Well, there's no problem with that one because the U.S. didn't sign it. There are a few others who didn't sign it. 3 countries which at that point had military occupations going on didn't sign it, because a military occupation almost inevitably means you're killing civilians. It's Israel, India, and Indonesia. So therefore attacks against civilians are standard. A couple of other countries didn't sign. Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Burma, Andorra, and a couple of others, including us. Right now, as you know, there's a trial going on of Saddam Hussein. The trial is for crimes that he committed in 1982. Well, there's an interesting year. 1982 is a very important year in U.S.-Iraqi relations. So, Free Press ought to have some headlines explaining that 1982 is the year when Ronald Reagan removed Iraq from the lists of states supporting terrorism so that the United States would be able to provide him with aid, including means to develop weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons, missiles, biological weapons, chemical weapons, and so on. And then a certain gentleman named Donald Rumsfeld flew over to Iraq to firm up the arrangement. That's 1982, the year in which for crimes that Saddam is now being tried for. And a second charge was just added correctly. It's the much worse crimes that he committed in the massacres of the Kurds in 1987. Well, how did the U.S. react to that? Blamed Iran, for the gas attacks against the Kurds and the massacres. No further reaction. Military aid, other aid continued. The U.S. did the same time, May 1987, even after Saddam did something that no country can get away with one exception. In May 1987, the Iraqi Air Force attacked a U.S. ship, USS Stark, in patrolling the Gulf, and killed 37 seamen. Well, almost nobody gets away with that. Now, the only other country that's gotten away with that is Israel in 1967 when it attacked the USS Liberty, also killing several dozen seamen. But there the circumstances were more ambiguous, although not very. And there was a lot of protest up to the highest level of the military and the government, and the Liberty crewmen, who in fact are still publishing their newspaper and seeking some kind of recognition and restitution about this, to no effect, of course. But in the case of the Stark, there was nothing. It was a demonstration of the passion of the love affair of the Reagan administration with Saddam. Unique. Just try to imagine if any other country did this, other than one that you really are deeply involved with. That's the year of the massive crimes for which Saddam's being charged. It continues. A year after that, a U.S. Cruiser, USS Vincennes, shot down an Iranian commercial airliner in the Gulf, in Iranian territorial waters, in commercial airspace. It killed 290 people. That convinced Iran that they'd better capitulate to Saddam Hussein's aggression. I mean, Saddam had invaded Iran with U.S. support, killed hundreds of thousands of people, chemical weapons, huge massacre. But this finally convinced the Iranians they better capitulate. They're not going to be able to fight the United States. The captain of the nearby vessel, nearby the Vincennes, was so horrified by what happened, he was watching it all, that he denounced it in the Navy's official journal, the Journal of the Naval Institute. He wrote there that he wondered aloud in disbelief as he observed the downing of what was obviously a civilian airliner in a commercial corridor. Perhaps, he said, out of a need to prove the viability of the high-tech missile system of the Vincennes, which they were calling Robo-Cruiser at the time because of the way it was behaving. The same journal, the Naval Institute Journal, published an acid review of the Navy Department cover-up written by a Marine Corps colonel, retired Marine Corps colonel, military historian David Evans. He quotes one high military officer attending the official hearings who concluded that our Navy is too dangerous to deploy. Well, that was taken care of by Bush #1. Remember, that's the liberal Bush. He said, I will never apologize for the United States of America. I don't care what the facts are. Well, Iranians do care what the facts are, and they've surely not forgotten, plus a lot more, back to 1953 when the U.S. and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government and installed a brutal tyrant. Forgetting is a luxury, but only for those who hold the clubs, like us. We can forget. The victims can't forget. Well, support for Saddam Hussein continued. It went on after the end of the Iraq War with no change. After Saddam Hussein's worst crimes, the atrocities against the Kurds, after the chemical warfare against Iran, still went on. And the way it went on is kind of remarkable. Here's some testimony before the Senate by Gary Milholland. He's one of the major nuclear experts in the United States. He points out that in 1989, remember, 1989, just remember what was going on then, the Pentagon and the Department of Energy invited 3 Iraqi scientists, with the blessing of the Department of State, to attend a detonation conference in Portland, Oregon. There they learned from experts all over the world how shockwaves detonate nuclear weapons. These 3 Iraqis came from the site that produced the first components for Iraq's high explosive portion of its first nuclear weapon. That's 1989, long after the end of the war with Iran, after the worst massacres and crimes for which we now claim we have to punish Saddam Hussein. Also continuing at that time was same aid, biotoxins, means to develop nuclear weapons and missiles, chemical warfare, and so on. And George Bush, #1, gave the reasons, not a secret. He was challenged on that. And he said, well, we have a responsibility to aid U.S. exporters. Besides, support for Saddam Hussein improves stability in the region. Okay, that went on up till probably the day of the invasion of Kuwait, same with the British. And it went on after the first war against Iraq. After. At the end of the war, February 1991, the U.S. had total control of the region. Just absolute. Iraqi army totally smashed. You may recall then that there was an uprising, Shiite uprising in the south, which the U.S. actually called for. And yes, there was a rebellion. Actually, it was assisted by rebelling Iraqi generals. They didn't ask the U.S. for any help, but they didn't expect what happened. What happened is that the Bush administration authorized Saddam Hussein to massacre them. They didn't say do it. They just authorized them to use military aircraft, heavy equipment, to slaughter the Shiite rebels. Probably tens of thousands of them. That's 1991. Well, again, the victims don't forget. And that was explained too. We prefer to forget, but it was explained. Actually, it was explained in the New York Times. The Middle East correspondent of the New York Times, Alan Cowell, is still there. He wrote, he said, well, we're kind of upset about these massacres, which the Shiites probably would have overthrown Saddam Hussein. But he said there was a consensus among the U.S. and its allies, that means Britain and Saudi Arabia, there was a consensus that Saddam Hussein offered more hope for the stability of the region than those who were trying to overthrow him. In other words, Iraqis do not have the right to overthrow Saddam Hussein. It's not going to be allowed, because then they'll be running their own country. So therefore, we'll support Saddam Hussein. The chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, it's a technical name that means pretty much a State Department representative in the New York Times. That was Thomas Friedman at the time. He explained it. He said, from the U.S. government point of view, he said, the best of all worlds for Iraq would be an iron-fisted military junta ruling Iraq the same way Saddam did. He's kind of an embarrassment, but we got to get somebody just like him. If we can't get him, we'll have to be satisfied. If there isn't anyone else, it'll have to be him. That's after the slaughter of the Shiites. Anybody remembering any of that? Like, it's not a deep secret. You don't look at classified information, just at the main newspaper in the world. Well, that's again, for those who have the luxury of forgetting, it's easy to forget. The victims don't. This and a lot more raises a number of questions, namely, who should be in the dock alongside of Saddam Hussein for these crimes alone? Well, that's another question that can't be asked, can't be considered. What should be done about Iraq? It is a real problem. Americans are right to regard it as a serious problem. Well, before trying to answer that question, you have to be clear about some basic principles. And there's one fundamental principle. That principle is that invading armies have no rights whatsoever. They have responsibilities but no rights. Their responsibilities are, first of all, doesn't matter whether it's the Russians in Afghanistan, the U.S. in Iraq, or anybody else, the Japanese in North China, pick your example. They have the responsibility, first of all, to pay reparations. In fact, enormous reparations to the victims. In this case, it's reparations not only for the invasion and the atrocities and so on and everything that followed the supreme international crime, but also for the sanctions, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, devastated the civilian society, strengthened the tyrant, probably preserved them, kept them from being overthrown the way other tyrants that the U.S. and Britain backed were overthrown, many of them quite similar to him. So reparations for that, and in fact a lot more. Reparations for the support for Saddam Hussein during the 1980s, during the period of his worst crimes. That's not just the U.S. and Britain, it's also others, like Germany and Russia and France and others. Yeah, they all owe massive reparations. These are points that generalize well beyond. The second responsibility of invaders is to follow the will of the victims. Well, we have a pretty good sense of what that is. There are regular U.S., British-run studies of popular opinion. The most recent one, a couple of weeks ago, was reported. Brookings Institution does a regular analysis of what they call the state of Iraq. It was published, you can find it in the New York Times. According to them, 87% of Iraqis want a concrete timeline for U.S. withdrawal. Well, that's up from 76% a year earlier. Well, if those figures are accurate, they're astonishing. What that means is approximately 100% of Iraqis in Arab Iraq. The Kurds don't care, there's no troops up there. But it means, if the figures are right, about 100% of Iraqis in Arab Iraq, where there actually are occupying forces, want a concrete timeline for withdrawal. I think if you'd done a poll in Vichy France, or say in Poland under Russian occupation, you would not have found figures like that. It's almost certain. Another thing to think about. Bush and Blair have an answer to that. Simple answer: no, there cannot be a timeline for withdrawal. Well, in part that just reflects the imperial mentality, deeply rooted imperial mentality. The voice of the lower orders just doesn't matter, so forget it. It also reflects the very general disdain of the powerful for democracy, which probably correlates pretty well through history with pontification about love of democracy. There's another research project you might try. But it's much more than that. Just consider, for example, what the consequences of withdrawal would be. Suppose that Iraq were actually granted some measure of sovereignty and a limited degree of democracy. That would be an absolute nightmare for Washington planners. So you can see why they're doing anything possible to prevent it. Well, just think what the foreign policy would be. They would have a Shiite majority. They would therefore have influence. They much prefer friendly relations with their powerful neighbor, Iran, Shiite, than hostile relations. They already have close relations. Majority of the religious clerics in Shiite Iraq come from Iran. Actually, Ayatollah Bastani comes from Iran, or have close connections with them. The main militia that's running the south, the Badr Brigade, was actually trained in Iran and fought with Iran during the Iran-Iraq War. They've maintained connections. They've been strengthening them since the invasion. And it goes beyond. Right across the border in Saudi Arabia, there's a Shiite majority, bitterly oppressed by the U.S.-backed fundamentalist tyranny, continually trying to get some degree of rights and freedom. Any move towards sovereignty across the border in Iraq is going to influence them. In fact, it already has. Find movements, pressures, demonstrations for autonomy. That happens to be where Saudi Arabian oil is. Iraqi oil is mostly in the Shiite area. Like a strange accident of history has placed most of the world's oil in Shiite areas, right around the Gulf. Iran, southern Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Just think what that means. That means possibly the development of an alliance, maybe a loose alliance, controlling most of the world's oil, independent of Washington. I mean, that's almost the worst nightmare that could be conjured up in Washington. Actually, it's a worse one. The U.S. is easily able to intimidate Europe. It doesn't take any trouble. You want people to stop investing in Iran, you shake your fist, the Europeans pull out. But not everybody can be intimidated. There's one country that refuses to be intimidated. That's why it's considered a huge threat. It's China. They've been around for 4,000 years. They've been telling the barbarians to get lost, and they don't get intimidated. So they continue to invest in Iran and in Saudi Arabia and to make military relations with both of them, which again must be driving the civilians in Washington berserk. China happens to be at the core of an Asian energy security grid. The rising Asian economies want to get energy security, and they're developing. Actually, India even has overcome hostility with China to establish significant joint projects of energy cooperation. India hasn't yet decided whether to join the Energy Asian group or to, be like Britain, sort of follow the orders of the master in Washington. That's what Bush's trip there was for a couple of weeks ago, allowing him to have nuclear weapons if they do the right thing. But they're kind of on the board. Could go either way. Well, if India joins, which is likely, South Korea is already there. Japan may or may not join. Russia's part of it. I mean, it's a huge system. If Iran joins, which they may give up on Europe. If they're part of an alliance that controls Middle East oil, the huge prize, the United States is a second-class power. I mean, it loses what was called back in the 40s by the State Department, just talking about the Middle East. It loses the stupendous source of strategic power and the greatest material prize in world history, along with the critical leverage that it provides and the veto power, these are all quotes, against our industrial rivals. You have your hand on that spigot, you're in the world. That was understood by the British 80 years ago. Well, if you lose all of this, and what's worse, it joins up with a growing Asian independent system. It's the most dynamic economic region of the world, holds half of the world's foreign reserves and so on. Then you're really in trouble. And that's not the end of it. There's also a Shanghai Cooperation Council, which, again, based in China, but with Russia, and extending into the same, mainly in Central Asia. The Central Asian countries are members of it, and they want independence from the United States. That's not a source of energy on the scale of the Middle East, but it's substantial and other resources. It's now regarded as kind of an alternative to NATO development. Well, suppose the Middle East oil system joins up with that. Now, you can see how frightening this is to Washington planners. Go on, but just you can figure it out for yourself. Any talk about exit strategies that does not consider these matters is just hot air. I mean, easy to make up exit strategies. But unless you consider what's involved, it's irrelevant. You have to at least consider what's involved. Well, we're not allowed to talk about any of this. Notice it's all ignored. Take a look at a huge discussion about exit strategies. See how much attention has been given to the fundamental reasons why the U.S. cannot permit sovereignty and democracy in Iraq. Can't. It would just be a terrible threat to the interest in dominating the world and controlling your industrial rivals. Stupendous source of strategic power and the rest of it. It's not a small thing. So we're going to fight tooth and nail to stop it. Doesn't mean that we should let them get away with it, but you might as well realize what's involved. It's not a matter of trying to figure out how many ships to send to pull the troops out. That's irrelevant. You've got to talk about these things and think about them. But we're not allowed to do it, and we're not allowed to do it because of the famous American exceptionalism. We have to be good North Koreans. We have to follow the principle that says we must not attribute any objectives to our leaders. They only act out of noble impulses, unlike everyone else in the world. So therefore, we're not allowed to mention any of these things. In particular, there's a kind of an obscene word, which I won't say because it's too vulgar, so I'll spell it. It's spelled O-I-L. You're not supposed to talk about that. You can talk about it if the Russians are invading Afghanistan, but not if the U.S. invades the second major resource of oil in the world, right in the center of the world's major energy resources. There, you can't mention it. It's called a conspiracy theory or something. We're supposed to believe that the U.S. and Britain would have been delighted to liberate Iraq if its chief export was, say, pickles and asparagus, and if the major energy resource in the world were in the South Pacific. If you don't believe that, you're a conspiracy theorist or some other kind of lunatic. Well, you know, as long as that kind of discipline reigns, we're in real trouble, and the world is in real trouble. Something that those are, you know, shackles that have to be broken, and those are problems right here. Well, enough about Iraq. Let's turn to the biggest threat in the world, namely Iran. The threat is its nuclear programs, okay? And no sane person wants Iran to have nuclear weapons, or for that matter, wants anyone to have nuclear weapons. It's too dangerous. But so far, but nevertheless, let's take a look at what's going on. I mean, so far, including, there was an announcement today that you might have seen that Iran announced that it had reached the level of uranium enrichment. Let's say that's true. Everything that is known about, including that, happens to be within Iran's legal rights. As a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, yeah, it's exactly what it's allowed to do. Article 4 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the main treaty on nuclear weapons, says that signers of the treaty, which Iran is, non-nuclear states, have the right to enrich uranium for nuclear energy. Furthermore, that's not another little thing that isn't talked about, is that these Iranian programs that we are denouncing today are exactly the same programs that the U.S. was initiating and supporting in 1977. Like my own university, MIT, back in 1977, under government initiative, was planning, may have done it, it's all in secret, but was planning to bring nuclear engineers from Iran to learn how to carry out uranium enrichment. And the U.S. government, like Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State at the time, explained that Iran needs nuclear energy. It should preserve its hydrocarbon resources for other uses and use nuclear energy for its energy resources. Well, now Henry Kissinger has a different line. He says Iran has so much oil it can't possibly need nuclear energy, so therefore it must be doing it to develop nuclear weapons. I think he was asked about that, you know, what's the difference in position. It's pretty frank and honest. He said, well, then they were an ally. So then they needed nuclear energy. And now they're an enemy. They're not following orders. So they don't need nuclear energy. But those are the same programs. You know, it's pretty hard to, like, again, you're holding the club, you're allowed to forget it, but Iranians don't forget it. Article 4 of the treaty, which does permit that, the Bush administration wants to strengthen Article 4 so that it doesn't permit uranium enrichment by non-nuclear states. And actually they have a case. I mean, on that they have a strong case, I think. The reason is technological development. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed in 1970, and at that time there was a considerable gap between producing nuclear energy and producing nuclear weapons. Since then, the gap has narrowed. So when you are capable of producing nuclear energy, you're a step away from nuclear weapons development. So it does make sense, as the Bush administration is calling for an international treaty to strengthen Article 4. That's a good idea. But it must ensure, quoting, unimpeded access for non-military use in accord with the initial treaty bargain. Okay, and there are ideas about how to do that. Mohammed al-Baradei is the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, last year's Nobel Peace Prize laureate. He proposed a couple of years ago that all production and processing of weapon-usable material should be restricted exclusively to facilities under multinational control, accompanied above all, I'm quoting, by an assurance that legitimate would-be users would get their supplies. He suggested that that would be the first step towards fully implementing a 1993 UN resolution calling for a fissile material cutoff treaty. It's known as FISBAN in the trade, which would cap and make public all inventories of fissile material still available. That would end the threat of nuclear weapons development and probable destruction of the species. Problem with all of this is it's dead in the water. The U.S. would never agree, certainly this administration, probably not any. In fact, to my knowledge, there's only one country that has agreed to El-Baradei's proposal. That's Iran. Last February, it publicly agreed to this proposal. I want you to do an internet search and see if you can see how much this was reported in the States. That suggests one way to resolve the crisis. Accept this proposal, join Iran, and accept this proposal. But it would be a way to resolve the crisis if the United States were willing to abandon its unique status as what's called an outlaw state, which is uniquely exempt from international law and norms and treaty obligations. That's one step. Well, Article 4 of the NPT is paired with another article, Article 6. Article 6 requires the nuclear states to carry out good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. Okay? Now, none of them have lived up to that obligation, which incidentally was reaffirmed by the World Court unanimously as a legal obligation. None of them have lived up to it, but the U.S. is by far the worst. The U.S. has last year officially rejected it, said it's not subject to Article 6, and it's developing new weapons, radical violation of it. In fact, it's even threatening use of nuclear weapons. You all know that. You're reading the newspapers. The Bush administration went on to rescind a collection of other treaties that were part of the initial bargain, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the ABM Treaty, but most important of all, FISBAN, Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. That was in November 2004. The U.S. had said it wasn't going to allow it, but nevertheless the UN voted on it. The vote was 174 to 1. There were 2 abstentions. One of them is Israel, which is reflexive, has to vote with the U.S. The other was more interesting. It was Britain. And the British ambassador explained his vote at the assembly meeting, said Britain supported the treaty. But this particular version, he said, divided the international community. It divided it 174 to 1. So therefore, Britain couldn't support it. Well, that tells you something about the priorities of new labor. Compare survival of the species with shining the master's shoes. Okay, guess which one wins. And that's not an exaggeration. This is probably the most important vote in UN history. It was not reported. I couldn't find a word about it, except in the technical journals, like the strategic analysis journals and the journals concerned with nuclear weapons and so on. Yeah, they reported it. And in fact, call it the most fundamental nuclear arms proposal. That's Princeton physicist and arms control specialist Frank von Hippel, one of the leading figures in this field. This is the kind of thin thread on which survival does hang, and it's further weakened, but not worth reporting. Well, there is every 5 years, there's a review conference on the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The last one was last May. It was a total disaster, completely collapsed. There was a fair amount of coverage. The press blamed Iran, following the master's voice again. If you read the technical literature, you find it was shattered by the United States. The U.S. simply announced that it was not going to abide by any of the previous agreements that the U.S. had made, that it was not subject to the major restriction, and just go jump in a lake, in other words. That was the end. It's now common to read that if Iran obtains nuclear weapons, then the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty, will be destroyed. Well, in reality, it's been shredded by Washington's abandonment of it. Something else we ought to talk about. Well, let's go back to Iran. In the year 2004, the European Union and Iran struck a bargain on how to deal with this situation. Iran agreed to temporarily suspend uranium enrichment, which it is legally allowed to do, but they said they would suspend it and in fact accept accelerated extra inspection procedures. That's their side of the bargain. And on the other side of the bargain, the European Union promised, these are the words, to give Iran firm guarantees on security issues. Now, what are security issues? Security issues mean the very credible U.S.-Israeli threats to bomb Iran. Those are the security issues. The U.S. is now willing to talk to Iran about security issues. Condoleezza Rice says, yeah, we'll talk to them about security issues. The security issues are their interference in Iraq. I mean, it's hard to read that without collapsing in ridicule. You know, suppose that Nazi Germany had said they'd deal with Britain on security issues, namely British interference in occupied France. You know, what could you say? Can you even make a comment about it? All right, that's what is meant here by security issues. But what the European Union and Iran meant are the real security issues, the very serious, very credible threats to bomb Iran. Well, Iran lived up to its side of the bargain. It did suspend uranium enrichment. The European Union, under U.S. pressure, backed down from its side of the bargain. Europe is very easily intimidated. So they backed down. Well, you know, after they backed down for a couple of years, Iran started up the programs of uranium enrichment. Makes another suggestion about how to deal with the crisis. And there's more. In May 2003, year before, Iran had offered to discuss security matters with the U.S. The U.S. refused. Same as North Korea. When the Bush administration came in 2001, it abandoned promises which had led to North Korea's withdrawal from any development of nuclear weapons. The Bush administration abandoned fuel supplies that had been promised, abandoned a nuclear reactor that had been promised, started making very hostile threats. The reaction was predictable. North Korea withdrew from the bargain. It withdrew from the NPT. It's now producing nuclear weapons. These things are pretty predictable. You know, doesn't take a genius to figure them out. Well, all of this suggests ways to reduce what's the major threat in the world. Iran's perhaps plans to develop nuclear weapons. One is to call off the threats that are virtually urging Iran to develop nuclear weapons just as a deterrent. Actually, the invasion of Iraq essentially sent the same instruction to the world. It said, we're going to attack anybody we feel like as long as they can't defend themselves. So you better develop a deterrent. And there's only two deterrents. One of them's terror, and the other is nuclear weapons. So exactly as predicted by intelligence agencies and analysts, the invasion of Iraq led to a sharp increase in terror and to proliferation. Again, it doesn't take a genius to predict it, and it was expected. So it happened. So one way is to stop raising the threats. This is incidentally well understood. One of Israel's leading military historians surely doesn't want Iran to develop nuclear weapons, Martin von Creveld. He said he doesn't know if they're developing nuclear weapons, but after the invasion of Iraq, if they're not developing them, he said they're crazy. I mean, the invasion of Iraq was an instruction. Develop nuclear weapons. You know, okay, so maybe they're doing it. Step one to do something about the crisis is call off the threats. Get the European Union to live up to its side of the bargain. Firm guarantees on security issues. Second step is to join every other power in the region and most of the world in taking steps to reintegrate Iran within the global economy. Third step is fist bump. Sign, join, stop dividing the international community 174 to 1 and join in the most important, quote von Hippel again, the most fundamental nuclear arms proposal. Yeah, join in that. That would make a big step forward. Fourth thing is pay some attention to Article 6. Stop violating it explicitly. and carry out the legal obligation to make good faith efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons. You don't do that, sooner or later the whole place is going to blow up. You can guess when, but it's going to happen. Even steps in that direction would mitigate the upcoming crisis. And above all, you should listen to the words of Muhammad al-Baradei, who said, there is no military solution to this situation. It's inconceivable. The only durable solution is a negotiated solution, and in fact it's within reach. It's not utopian. Well, Iran and Iraq are the greatest concerns of the population, probably the least concern of places that get massive coverage is the people. In Iraq and Iran, it's too obvious to discuss. What about the Palestinians? Well, that's very much in the news. It's in the news in the context of Israeli interests. So a lot of coverage of the last Israeli elections. The New York Times had a big editorial praising Israel because it said Israeli voters have endorsed the idea of withdrawing from the West Bank. And of course, there was a slight question of borders, but it added figuring out what the border should look like is the least of the problems. Yeah, from the New York Times editorial office. Who cares? Not when you look at a map. And that's not so simple, because the U.S. press is very judicious in not providing maps. And there's a very good reason. Take a look at a map, whether it's Camp David or today and so on, you see exactly what this magnanimous proposal is. We're supposed to talk, read the Times again, you're supposed to talk about the anguish of the people in the West Bank, namely the settlers. The anguish of the settlers who were subsidized to go off into remote areas and are now being subsidized to go back into the areas that Israel's going to annex illegally, of course. So we have to worry about their anguish, not the Palestinians. That's the New York Times. Let's take a look at the world's major business journal, the London Financial Times. They had an editorial the same day, and they described what the vote was about. It said Israel voted to take in large swaths of the West Bank, occupied East Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, which means imprisoning everything that's left. Mr. Olmert's prospective land annexation would take nearly half of the 22% of colonial Palestine that the Palestinians want for their state. Such a land grab would leave the Palestinians with 3 discontiguous cantons, a recipe for a failed state. Israel's so-called security barrier daily gobbles up more Palestinian land. Again, you look at a map, you see exactly what this means. Israel, this magnanimous vote that the New York Times is hailing, means Israel annexes the valuable land, the resources, particularly the water resources. It sends 2 salients through the West Bank, which divided up into 3 cantons, all imprisoned because it holds on to the Jordan Valley. Take a look at a map, you see exactly what this means. All virtually separated from one another, virtually separated from some little part of East Jerusalem that may be left, all illegal, condemned by the Security Council as far back as 1968, and repeatedly since. The World Court unanimously, including the American Justice, agreed that the Geneva Conventions apply to the occupied territories, meaning any transfer of population to them is a breach of the Geneva Conventions. Every signatory, including the United States, is legally bound to do everything possible to prevent that. What we're doing is subsidizing it and praising it. That included, incidentally, the U.S. Justice, contrary to what you read, who said that any part of the separation wall that is there to protect settlements is ipso facto illegal. It's around 80% of it. Also totally inhuman, but it doesn't matter. The lower orders are of no account as long as they're subdued. Well, it's gone on longer than I expected, so I'm going to skip the rest. I was going to talk about domestic concern, the healthcare issue, which is very severe and extremely interesting, and also about what I think ought to be the leading concerns. I'll just mention what I think they ought to be, that you can talk about them if you like. The first one, the most important. Okay, the most important, there are 2 threats that are literally threats to survival. I mean, they ought to be at the top of anybody's agenda. The most serious of them is barely discussed, except in technical circles. That's the threat of nuclear war, which is imminent and increasing. Just read, people who are concerned with these issues are warning as loudly as they can, from the most authoritative figures you hear, conservative figures you're hearing about apocalypse soon, an appreciable risk of ultimate doom, an Armageddon of our own making, and on and on. The reasons are very well understood. The Bush administration's aggressive militarism and what's called the transformation of the military, Rumsfeld's pet deal, now including militarization of space, that has predictable reactions on the part of potential adversaries. They are well understood. They don't say, thank you, here's my throat, please cut it. They respond as they can. And they're not going to compete with the United States militarily. The U.S. economically is just one of several major powers, but militarily it's off the scale. It's about half the military spending in the world. In the militarization of space, which is one of the worst dangers, about 95% is from the United States. Nobody else is even trying. And that's a huge danger. And well understood. That includes so-called missile defense. So they respond as they can, which for most means terror and nuclear proliferation. For Russia, what it meant already is a very sharp increase in offensive military capacity aimed at the United States. It's a serious danger. China has been very conservative so far. It hasn't done much. But it's beginning to follow suit, inevitably, and that has a ripple effect. China increases offensive military capacity. India reacts. Pakistan reacts to India. Pakistan's much more dangerous than Iran, and we're often running, not for long. All of these systems are on hair trigger alert, computer controlled. We know about our systems. They have many errors, and there are thousands of errors where the computers warn of a missile attack, and there's time for human intervention, I think 3 minutes for human analysis, and so far it's always said, okay, it was an error, they didn't blow up the world. Then if the 3 minutes, whatever it is, are over, the president is supposed to make a decision. I think he gets 30 seconds. And that's what the survival of the species depends on. Well, that's our systems. Their systems are much worse. And we're driving them to rely on very deteriorating inferior systems. And the more you get down the level, China, India, Pakistan, the worse it gets. That's what we're driving them to. That's why you hear warnings from people like Sam Nunn, conservative senators, and in the forefront of efforts to stop all this, that we're creating an Armageddon of our own making, and so on. The threat of just accidental nuclear war is severe and increasing as a result of conscious decisions. It's not happening, these are human decisions, they aren't natural laws. That's a real nuclear war. There's plenty of other threats, like a dirty bomb. It's not a major missile attack, it's bad enough. According to U.S. intelligence, their consensus is it's inevitable. Former Secretaries of Defense, like McNamara and Perry, predict that the probability of a dirty bomb in the next decade is about 50%. Richard Garwin, who's a famous physicist, is one of the leading weapons specialists. His estimate is maybe the next 4 or 5 years, that's 50%. And it's well known how to deal with this, along the lines I mentioned. But instead, what we're doing is making it worse. Well, the second crisis, which is a crisis of survival, fortunately is discussed, and that's environmental catastrophe. You can debate the details, but the consensus among scientists is almost, it's higher than on almost any other topic I can think of. There's an overwhelming consensus. You can find maybe 3 or 4 people who write in the Wall Street Journal, but for everyone else, there's a consensus. One exception, the scientist in the White House doesn't agree, but outside of that, there's a consensus that it's serious, in fact, maybe catastrophic, maybe soon, maybe unstoppable. Well, you can debate the details. The more that's learned, the worse it looks. How to deal with it can be debated too, but there's one thing that's clear, and that is the longer you delay, the worse it's going to be. And that means, like our grandchildren, maybe. It's not that far off. and at least some measures are well within reach and indeed well understood. Well, there's a third major problem in addition to these two, and that is that the first two major problems, matters of survival, are being consciously enhanced by the world's leading power. Consciously. I mean, it's not because they want the consequences, because they don't care. They're just not high priorities. And survival of the species is not a high priority. Much higher priority is, stuffing the pockets of your rich friends with plenty of dollars, reversing all the social progress of the last century, waving your fist at the world, and so on. Those are high priorities. Species survives, somebody else, stuff happens, as Rumsfeld says. Those are three huge problems. Now, it's important to make clear that it's the government that's doing this. Population doesn't agree. Population is strongly opposed. I mean, there isn't any much, you can almost be certain on nuclear war, but people don't talk about it, so we don't know. But on the environment, we know. So take, say, the Kyoto Protocols. You read in the press that the United States refused to sign them, major industrial power. Well, that's only true if the phrase United States excludes its population. Population was overwhelmingly in favor of it. In fact, so strongly in favor that Bush voters thought that he was in favor, because it's so obviously the right thing to do that they assumed he must be in favor of it. This generalizes over the whole election. Voters had very little idea what the stands of the candidates were, not because they're stupid or not interested, because the elections are designed that way. They're designed to make sure that people don't know the stands of the candidates. It's kind of like selling toothpaste or something. You sell candidates. Imagery for delusion. You don't want to give information. Well, that's a serious problem. It's called a democratic deficit. Formal democratic institutions, but they don't function. And on issue after issue, both political parties, the governing party to an extreme extent, but both of them are way to the right of the population, to the jingoist, militaristic side, on a whole host of issues. Just to mention one example at the time. After this constant polling of public opinion here, very well polled society, good studies. After the last federal budget was announced, February 2005, the major polling institution in the world, Maryland-based Program of International Policy Attitudes, did a study of people's attitudes on the budget. And they're very interesting. They were the inverse of the budget, almost precisely, by huge majorities. Where spending was going up, public wanted to go down. Military spending, supplementals for Iraq and Afghanistan and so on. Where the budget was going down, huge majorities wanted to go up. Social spending, health, education, veterans benefits, renewable energy, support for the United Nations, and right across the line. Literally the inverse. On the tax cut, which the press calls sacrosanct, politically untouchable, a huge majority wanted cut rescinded for anyone with incomes over $200,000. That's almost the entire tax cut. On health, people's main concern, because they can't afford it. They have to, for a long time, large majorities have been in favor of a national health care system. Well, when that's ever mentioned in the press, it's called politically impossible or lacking political support, which is a good indication of what it means to be a failed state. Political support means pharmaceutical companies support it, financial institutions support it. Now, that's political support. If the public supports it, it lacks political support. And that's consistent. And this is a huge problem. It's people's main problem for good reasons. It'll be an even worse problem in the future. Well, that all gives some very conservative suggestions about things that should be done, and they're very much within reach. There are illusions, and that's the main problem that we face. One of the illusions is that we can't do anything. There's been extremely successful propaganda in indoctrinating people into thinking you're helpless, can't do anything. We don't have the privileges of, say, peasants in Bolivia. who can have an actual election, in which people know about the issues, and they're important issues, and they're out there working on them, and they elect someone from their own ranks. I mean, yeah, they're privileged, they can do it, but we can't do it. What can we do? We're so just helpless and hopeless. I mean, until we can break through that, the world's going to go to hell in a handbasket. I mean, these are real dangers, and there's a lot that we can do. We have a unique legacy of privilege and freedom. It's unique. There's nothing like it in the world. It was never given by anyone. It was won, by hard struggle of people before us, but they left us the legacy. Now you can decide what to do with it. You can abandon it because we're helpless. We can't do what Bolivian peasants can do, so we're helpless. That's one choice. The other choice is to take the legacy and carry it forward, and that's a choice for every single person, and it's impossible to exaggerate the importance of what the decision will be.
Some time for questions now. I'm going to ask that you limit your response to a question. Please only ask a question, and then we'll let him respond. So,
it's a real quick question. How do you feel being named one of the 100 most dangerous professors in the world?
Well, considering the guy who named the it's high praise. Actually, there are a lot of people who are very upset because they weren't on that list. Actually, what it reminds me of, the truth is Nixon's enemies list, which I happen to be on. But it was a complete joke, incidentally. I mean, I didn't mean to think. But they made a huge fuss about it, not because I was on it, but because powerful people were on it, like the CEO of IBM and George Bundy and so on. So huge business Watergate crisis. But there were a lot of people who were pretty upset that they weren't on it. And it's understandable. Same with David Horowitz's hate list. Yeah.
I want to tell you that the first time, this is the second time that I listened to you. The first time was many years ago. I was a undergrad student at the University of Southern California. And I heard you talk, and you were one of the sources of inspiration for me to focus on the study of American foreign policy. Today, I am a professor here in the political science department, and I'm teaching American foreign policy.
Good.
So I welcome you here, and I have a question regarding
you're the 101st dangerous professor.
Yeah. No, I don't think so. I hope not. I hope not to be on the book. But what would you suggest should be American foreign policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, here again, I think that in most of these cases, I think there's a very simple answer, also in that one. There has been an international consensus since the mid-1970s. It is overwhelming. The international consensus is for a two-state settlement on the international border with maybe minor and mutual adjustments that happen to be official U.S. policy up till 1971. A settlement on the international border, straighten out some of the curved lines left from the peace agreement and so on. The two states should be Israel and Palestine. There is an overwhelming international consensus. Arab states, PLO, Europe, Asia, everybody, except for the United States. The United States has been blocking it since 1976. In 1976 was the first Security Council resolution calling for this. It was advanced by what are called the confrontation states, Syria, Egypt, and Jordan, but the rest of the Arab world, in relevant part, joined. It's mostly supported by the whole world. He was vetoed it. vetoed another similar resolution in 1980. It's been blocking General Assembly resolutions, year after year. The votes are like 151 to 2 and so on. And in fact, I won't go through the whole record, but there's been literally 1 month in the last 35 years in which the U.S. has not totally blocked it. That was January 2001, Clinton's last month. And Clinton's last month in office, he recognized that the Camp David proposals, which everybody had been cheering as magnanimous and so on, were totally impossible, and he made a different proposal, which was then not an unreasonable one. It was vague, but it was sort of toward the international consensus. Negotiations took place in Taba, Egypt, between Israel and Palestinian Authority within what were called the Clinton parameters, framework he'd set up. They were coming pretty close to an agreement, which was not far from the international consensus. It wasn't finished, but it was pretty close. In their final press conference, both sides said that if they had a little more time, they might be able to settle it. Well, they didn't have a little more time. Israel called it off. Okay. Then comes Sharon and Bush, and we're finished. They continued to negotiate. It's called track 2, informal negotiations, high-level people, but not formal. That led to a proposal called the Geneva Accord, which, of course, it was released in Geneva in December 2002, which again was pretty close to the international consensus. You can debate the terms, the details. It was certainly a basis for settlement, a basis for negotiation for settlement. Well, almost the entire world sent representatives or strong support, messages of support. Israel rejected it. The U.S. disregarded it. Didn't even reject it, just disregarded it. So the New York Times had a dismissive article saying it's nonsense. Okay, that's that. It's still alive. They're still working on it. But the more you go on, the harder it gets. Remember what is the current proposals that the New York Times, in fact most of the press in the West is hailing in the United States, are the end. They're saying, okay, we're going to pose a settlement which makes a Palestinian state impossible. What will be left are isolated camp towns, hemmed in, imprisoned. The people can rot or leave and so on. And Israel will take whatever it wants. Well, Israel can do it because people like us are sitting by. The U.S. is paying for it, giving them military, diplomatic, and economic support. Meanwhile, it talks about democracy and so on. And as long as the American population allows that, it will happen. That's another instance, incidentally, of the democratic deficit. Around 2/3 of the population in the United States is opposed to this, strongly opposed. But as long as policy is divorced from public opinion, it doesn't make any difference. You live in a state with formal institutions, but they don't function. It doesn't make any difference what the public thinks. But that's not a law of nature. That can be changed. And yes, there is a solution, and everybody understands what it is. And it's been around since the mid-70s. And it doesn't get implemented because the U.S. has not permitted it. There's one exception that I mentioned. So yeah, there's a solution. Not a wonderful solution. I don't like it particularly. But it's a lot better than any existing alternative. And it could be kind of like Ireland. It could cut down the level of violence and hostility and anger and so on, and lead the way to a better solution. For Ireland, it probably means unification, but it's going to take time. And something like that's probably necessary there too. It's got to go in stages. And the first stage is just to cut down the conflict and the violence and atrocities and oppression and so on and so forth. And that's the way to do it. And it's within reach. It's not utopian.
Go ahead.
In this group, I think we might be all responsive to the concept. I think we're all responsive to what you're saying. I think a lot of us probably are very familiar with this. And there's a lot of times it comes down to, okay, we see a problem, how do we change it? And failed states, I think, is a great I think most people in America really relate to that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people feel like maybe there's been a hijacking of the country, but maybe it was designed that way. Would you maybe delve more into what you see would be towards a solution?
I think the solutions are obvious. I mean, everything I mentioned, there's an obvious solution. The one thing that has to happen is we have to do something about it. And we can do anything we want. We are not less privileged than the living in heaven. You know? I mean, if somebody's watching this from Mars, they wouldn't know what to say. You know, I mean, people in the richest, most privileged country, in the freest country in the world, say, "I can't do anything." I mean, you got every possible opportunity. The people in the poorest country in South America can organize and act and, you know, achieve their goals and elect somebody from their own ranks and have a real election. And that's not the only case, incidentally. I mean, yeah, there's, you want to learn something about democracy, go to the South.
Venezuela. Venezuela was one of them.
Yeah, Venezuela. Why is it considered by the U.S. such a threat? Why is the U.S. running naval exercises off Venezuela and threatening it? Why did the Bush administration try to carry out a military coup to overthrow it? Well, the reason is it's the most popular government in Latin America. I mean, there's good, you know, Latin Americans are actually able to run polls, believe it or not. You know, it's not just us. And they do, you know, good, careful polls. There's regular polling of attitudes towards democracy in Latin America, which incidentally has been declining, support for it. It's been declining in parallel with the so-called neoliberal measures for very good reason, because they're all attacks on democracy. So the more you impose those measures, the more support for democracy declines. But there's a couple of exceptions, and the leading exception is Venezuela. In the last 8 years, the Chavez years, support for democracy in Venezuela has gone way up, and now it's far and away has the most support for the elected government in Latin America. So naturally it's a threat. If you really, you know, if you despise democracy, of course it's a threat. And therefore we have to stir people up and try to subvert the government and try to carry out military coups and so on. Yeah, that's right. That's not the only case. I mean, from Venezuela down to Argentina, some really important things are happening. It's the first time in the history of the continent, first time since the Spanish conquest, literally, that the Latin American countries are kind of getting their act together. You know, up until now, they've been, you know, they're very sharply divided. There's very high inequality. You know, there's tiny elites, super rich, or else totally impoverished. But the elites have been separated from one another. So the Latin American countries traditionally have been geared towards the imperial master. You know, that's where they send their capital, that's where their second homes are, that's where their kids go to study, that's what they copy for intellectuals and so on. But not to each other. Even the transportation system has been oriented towards export. There are imports, but luxury goods. Compare with East Asia, we're no richer, you know, but the imports are capital goods, and they can't export capital. Latin America can export any capital they want. Well, they're finally overcoming this. They're beginning to move towards some kind of integration. Argentina threw out the IMF. It's pretty amazing. You know, they decide we're going to rid ourselves of the IMF, enough of this strangulation. The IMF means the U.S. Treasury Department. It does, literally. And they said we're ridding ourselves of the IMF. They paid off the debt with the help of Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela really is a threat. You know, if the capacity of the U.S. to carry out military action has been reduced, and the capacity for economic strangulation is also being reduced. And those are the two main measures of control. That's why the number of military officers in Latin America, U.S., is probably the highest it's been maybe ever, you know, and why the training of Latin American officers is sharply increasing. I mean, they're concerned, badly concerned, that most of the region's out of control. I mean, what call themselves the Indian population, the indigenous population, are uniting. I mean, that's one of the things that happened in Bolivia. Indian majority voted in their own president. Similar things are just about happening in Peru. Soon happened in Ecuador. Happened a couple of times in Ecuador. And what's more, they're uniting. In fact, there's even calls for an Indian nation. They want to control their own resources. And in fact, a lot of them are saying they don't even want the resources developed. I mean, there are a lot of, you find plenty of indigenous people in, Ecuador and Bolivia who don't see any particular reason why their lives and culture and society should be destroyed so that people can sit in SUVs and traffic jams in New York. Doesn't sound like a great thing to do. Well, that's a huge problem for the U.S., which has been counting on, when you take a look at U.S. intelligence projections, they count on controlling Middle East oil, but using Western Hemisphere oil because it's safer. Well, they've lost, they're in the process of losing the major supplier, Venezuela, because of hostility. Bolivia, next largest supplier of natural gas, trying to control its own resources. The Bush administration, you have to give them credit for something. They have a talent for alienating allies, which is just unbelievable. They have even succeeded in alienating Canada. That is an achievement that, you have to give them gold stars for that. You can't alienate Canada. They've done it. Canada's one of the biggest oil exporters to the United States. Well, the United States lost a series of NAFTA decisions to Canada, and naturally the U.S. just told them to get lost. Well, Canadians weren't too happy with it. In fact, the Minister of Resources, I don't know if he means it, but he said, all right, we'll start redirecting our oil resources to China. They're happy to have them. If you can manage to do that, you really, as I say, it requires real talent. But they are in deep trouble now. They're possibly going, they could lose control of the Middle East resources, which is the huge prize, because of the actions they're taking. They've alienated Venezuela. They're forcing Venezuela to diversify. China's and others perfectly happy to move in. Latin America is beginning to unify, independent of the U.S. It's a very dangerous situation. If there's a tiger running around in your backyard, it's dangerous. If it's a wounded tiger, it's extra dangerous. And that's sort of the situation we're in. And it's something to be concerned about.
Mr. Chomsky, just a reminder, we have about 8 more minutes of question-answer session. Yeah. Then he'll be signing books for 30 minutes. We're only limited to 30 minutes due to the schedule back there. So let's wrap this up. Thanks.
Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Chomsky. After reading some of your books, I get the impression that you have a very dim view of the two major political parties.
What are the two?
And so I was wondering if you thought that there has ever been anyone to run for president in the United States that has been worth voting for.
Yeah, first of all, this happens to be an unusually bad period. But it's not the first time. There have been other periods like this. And there have been times when it was better, but to tell you the honest truth, I think it's the wrong question. The way we are trained to think, political participation means you spend most of your life at Walmart, and once every 4 years, you go somewhere and you push a button. Okay, that's not political participation. Again, you can learn lessons from the poorest people in the hemisphere, from Haitians, from Bolivians, others. Take, say, the Bolivian elections, which happen to be the most recent ones, and really were democratic elections of a remarkable kind. But they did not happen only at election time. Those same mass popular organizations have been doing things for years. They blocked, it was pretty fantastic, they blocked an effort by the government to follow World Bank orders and privatize water. Privatize water, they tell you in the economics department, that's very important, because then you can get the prices right, and it's more efficient, and so on. There's a little footnote, most of the population can't afford it, but everything can't be perfect. But they just blocked it. They blocked it by mass demonstrations. People got killed, so on, but they were out there. And the same is true on issue after issue. Well, that's political participation. It's something that goes on all the time. You know, like when we have had periods of live political activity in the country, the 1960s, for example, which changed the country a lot, but it was not pushing buttons. It was constant action, which did compel some legislation finally, but that was kind of like the icing on the cake. You know, it was the actions that were going on were changing things, changing attitudes, opinions, behavior. You know, finally led sometimes to signing legislation. And that's happened before. That's where the New Deal came from. Just about everything decent you can think of. That's political participation. We are indoctrinated deeply from infancy to think we can't do anything. Life consists of amassing commodities you don't want. That's life. You know, anything else is impossible. Okay, as long as you're trained and accept that, and if our leader says something, we repeat it, because that's what we're supposed to do. I mean, if you're really going to accept that, yeah, then it's hopeless. But you don't have to accept it any more than people here have done in the past. Or I don't want to. I mean, elections are not unimportant, but they only mean something if they're coming out of mass popular engagement that's going on all the time. Okay, then sometimes an election represents something that the population wants. But it's the rest of it that matters.
I think we're going to take one more question, and then we'll have the book signing. So go ahead, please.
Recently, we've seen the government do exactly the opposite of what the population has wanted us to do, and I think that's due to propaganda. But what makes Americans in particular so susceptible to propaganda?
Well, first of all, it's not all that different than the rest of the West. I mean, the U.S. is kind of a little extreme, but Europe isn't all that different. I mean, it's sort of the same. Europe's kind of like a decade behind the United States in the capacity of wealth and power to undermine democracy, to destroy the social market system, benefits, and so on. It's really the same way. What makes people susceptible? First of all, they're not susceptible. For example, in the 1960s, they certainly weren't susceptible. In fact, today, if you really count people, I think there are more people engaged in activism today than there were in the 1960s. I mean, there are movements today that didn't exist in the 1960s. Actually, I remember the first time I came here, it was like 20 years ago, I was very struck by the fact here and in other parts of the Midwest by the solidarity movements. I mean, these were coming out of right in the mainstream, Central American solidarity movements, Christian evangelical churches and others. That's nothing new in the history of imperialism. I mean, nobody in France ever thought of living in an Algerian village to protect people. You know, it's unheard of. Nobody went to a Vietnamese village. People went to Central America, tens of thousands of them, many still there. They're now spread all around the world. Christian peacemakers, others, international solidarity movement. These are very important developments. You know, the first case of real North-South solidarity means something, not just signing a name or marching, but actually participating. That's very real. It was coming right out of the mainstream in the United States, places like this, in fact. And that's grown and continued. The global justice movements, what are idiotically called anti-globalization movements, it's something totally new. You know, you've never in history had anything like a real international, you know, big mass popular organizations. It's not just the meetings every year in Porto Alegre or Caracas or wherever it is. It's also they're spawning regional social forums, which are doing things all over the place. That's all totally new, hasn't ever happened in hundreds of years of Western imperialism. And it's engaging an enormous number of people. The problem is not that people are passive, it's that they're isolated. So like in one part of town, they don't know what they're doing in the other part of town. And many people, you know, want to do something, they don't know where to go, you know, even though there's something next door that they can go to. I mean, that capacity, that achievement of separating and atomizing people and, you know, forcing them into, you know, directing them into just personal saving yourself, like by buying things you don't want or working twice as hard as anybody in the world and so on. That, you know, that kind of thing has had an effect. But you know, these aren't like torture chambers. You know, these are things you can overcome easily, in fact.
Please help me thank your name again.